Hello, conservationists, and welcome to our discussion of fisheries management. My name is Mr. Foes, and I'll be giving this lecture today because I studied fisheries management for my master's project at WKU. So, I'd like to begin by asking, what is a fishery? Well, in short, a fishery is aquatic organisms, aquatic habitats, and people interacting with both. So a fishery really consists of three parts. And if you want to know more about what fisheries management entails, you can read this book, Inland Fisheries Management in North America by Christopher Kohler and Wayne Hubert. So as I mentioned, a fishery consists of three parts. And so managing a fishery involves understanding all three of these parts. And those three parts are organisms, habitats, and people. And when we take a closer look, the organisms, we need to understand their taxonomy, things like how they're related to each other and how they're classified and named, their ecology, how they interact with each other and their environment, population dynamics, how the size of the groups change over time, their life histories, the age at which they reproduce, the age at which they die, or how they spawn. Stocking, this has to do with growing and raising young fish in hatcheries and then introducing them into systems. And that brings us to introductions, which may include stocking, but an introduction would be putting a new species into a place where it didn't occur previously. And then things like population reduction, which has mostly to do with harvesting and the natural death of species. Also, we have to include habitats. So understanding a fisheries habitat is mostly aquatic. And the study of water and its layers is limnology. Also, water quality is important for the species that live within it. Water quantity, the amount of rain influences this. The regulation of water moving through dams influences this. Pond and reservoir construction. When people want to raise fish or keep fish on their property, they may need to construct a reservoir or a pond to provide habitat for fish. Also, things like in-water structures. These provide places for fish to hide, for fish to spawn, or maybe for them to live while they're young and growing. Also, it provides places for anglers to seek when attempting to harvest fish. And that brings us to our last point of habitats, and that's access, because many streams and aquatic systems are inaccessible to people. The ability for people to access them is important when we consider the habitat. And that brings us to the third part of this three-way Venn diagram, and that is people. People interact with the organisms and the habitat to encompass what we know as a fishery. So when we understand people, there are many components that they bring to the table as well, such as sociology and economics, the money that can be made from fisheries. Politics are important to consider when we manage these type of resources. Laws are in place to protect them and regulate them, and regulations are designed to help people understand the laws and be able to practice fisheries management within the law. Planning is something that is done by fisheries managers. Information is made available to the public, and education is something that is provided to people who are involved in fisheries management. I'd like to pause right here and point out that these three things, organisms, habitats, and people, are not unique to managing a fishery. This lecture should be used as an example for managing many similar resources. Other types of wildlife can be managed this way, and even things like plants. A lot of natural resources, when managed, consider these three components: organisms, habitat, and people. So let's take a historical approach to fisheries management. Historically, fisheries equated to food. When people managed fish as a resource, they did so to increase the availability of food for people. So through the 1800s and 1900s, we saw a transition of this resource. So during the 1800s, as people moved from east to west across North America, there was a major exploitation of aquatic ecosystems where people took what they could for food and to provide nourishment for people as they traveled, followed by indiscriminate stocking. And it was indiscriminate because there was little regard for the effects that stocking would have on the ecosystem or the future of that habitat. And by stocking, again, I mean placing fish in a place where they didn't previously exist, or introducing more to boost the population. Some of this was even done as train cars passed over creeks and streams. They would literally dump buckets of fish and fish eggs into streams as they went by. During the 1900s, we saw a transition of stocking programs and regulations developing. By the 1970s, an ecosystem approach was introduced to the management of fisheries, and we'll come back to this in a minute. Also during the 1900s, we saw a significant increase in pond production. To give you an idea of how many ponds exist in North America, in 1950 there were about 1 million ponds. By 1970, there were 3 million. By 1980, there were 7 million, and by 1990, there were 9 million ponds. Here's a diagram that depicts the ponds in North America. You can see places like Texas and Missouri are leading. So as I mentioned, we would come back to the ecosystem approach to management. This is a very significant transition from the way that we used to manage resources to the way that resources are managed now. And mostly what this does is it recognizes the resource as part of an entire ecosystem. And it understands that a change in any part of the system can affect all other parts. So here's a diagram developed by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and their interpretation of an ecosystem-based management plan for fisheries. So we can see that the previous or the conventional management practice included focusing on one species and individual activities, and it was a very narrow focused approach with little regard for what other elements of an ecosystem or of a society or of a habitat may be affected. Whereas the ecosystem-based management approach considers multiple species at once, and it understands that humans are an integral part of an ecosystem. It may also include a multi-sector resource management, where fisheries management also coordinates with wildlife management and with land management and forest management. And an adaptive management-based system is implemented, and it's based on scientific monitoring. And what this means is that a plan may be devised and implemented and then changed as seen necessary. Also, the information was shared and standardized across the board so that one place could change their management strategy according to how other places were doing it. So currently that's the model we use, and we've shifted a lot of our focus from food to food and recreation. A lot of people still fish for food, but a lot of people do what's called catch and release, where they may catch fish and let them go, and they do it strictly for fun or for sport. These people are still an important part of how fisheries are managed. Also, because fish are a renewable resource and their populations change over time, typically a fishery is managed to promote what's called optimal sustainable yield. An optimal sustainable yield is simply the most fish that can be removed from a system in a single year without reducing the yield the following years, meaning that it's as many fish as can be taken, so that that many fish can be taken every year following. And this hinges upon our understanding of the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. So if you remember, a carrying capacity is something that is determined based on limiting factors that may be keeping the population from getting bigger. Things like disease, things like a lack of food or a lack of space, or people harvesting fish. And every year, the population may grow as fish reproduce and spawn, and then the population may decline as predators take their share of that population, as some fish get old, as people harvest them. And so the idea of sustaining a fishery is to try to keep it as close to the carrying capacity as possible each year. And when we do that, we call it the optimal sustainable yield. In Kentucky, fisheries are managed by the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, and within that is the Fisheries Division. And the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources employs a lot of people. And these people earn their income mostly through the sale of fishing licenses and fines and penalties. So if you live in Kentucky and you would like to fish in Kentucky, you can buy a fishing license that gives you access to catch fish in this state. And that money goes to support the biologists who study the populations and their sampling gear and their facilities. And it also goes to pay the wildlife officers, the men and women who enforce the laws, who make sure that people using this resource don't take more than their share or violate the rights of other people. And if people do violate those laws, then they may be fined or penalties may be assessed against them. And that money is also collected to support the management of fisheries. Additionally, some funding comes from a federal fund called Dingell Johnson. And Dingell Johnson is named after the two individuals, the representatives who sponsored this bill. And the way this bill works is, because it's a federal bill, it develops a fund within the federal government, and the money that goes into this fund comes from a small tax that is placed on any items that are purchased for fishing. So if you buy a boat, or if you buy fishing tackle, or if you fill up your gas tank at a marina, there's a small tax on all of these things that go into a fund, and that fund is then distributed to states depending on their need. So some money comes from the Dingell Johnson Act fund to support the management of fisheries within a state. There's a similar act called the Pittman-Robertson Act, and it's designed to support hunting management. So that would be things like deer, turkey, pheasants, quail, any of the wildlife that are managed by the state. There's also a federal fund that may go to support those, and that's distributed to all states depending on need. So if you purchased camouflage clothing, a gun, a box of ammo, any of those things that you may purchase will also have a tax on them that go to support the Pittman-Robertson Fund. Okay, let's talk about the people who do research on fish in order to provide information so that regulations may be determined. These are the people who determine what the optimal sustainable yield is for any population within a fishery. And these people are fisheries biologists. So when they determine the sustainable harvest amounts, the primary information for this comes from angler reports, where every year people called creel clerks may be hired. This is a temporary position. Creel clerks may be hired to go monitor certain lakes on the weekends throughout the spring and summer, and they'll approach anglers and ask them what they've been fishing for, what they've been catching. They may identify their catch and take some measurements, and they'll report that back to the Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. Also, if you have bought a fishing license or a hunting license in this state, you may have filled out a survey where the department will send out letters or emails to people who purchase licenses and ask them about their experience and about what they harvested and their opinion on the way that the resources have been managed. And these things influence the way fisheries biologists will determine harvest rates for the following years. Also, the biologists do a lot of sampling themselves. In this image here, we see they're doing something called electrofishing, where they have a generator that's attached to two large electrodes on the front of the boat, which drop into the water and create an electrical current through the water, which will temporarily stun any fish that get in between those electrodes. They'll float to the top. The two individuals in the front can then net them and either take them back to the laboratory for further sampling, or often what they do is they'll take a measurement, usually length, weight, an estimate of age, and they may also squeeze them to see if they are gravid with eggs or milt, which is another name for fish sperm, and then they'll release them once they get the data they need. Also, fisheries biologists sample with several different types of sampling strategies, and that depends on the species of fish that they're targeting or the age of the fish. So different types of nets may be deployed to catch certain types of fish in different habitats. And state biologists, if they get time, they may report their findings to an academic journal like the North American Journal of Fisheries Management, where students and the public and other fisheries biologists may be able to access this information and learn more about how fisheries management works. So that's all I have for you all. I hope you've learned something. And again, I just want to reiterate that this lecture was focused specifically on fisheries management, but many of the concepts that are deployed in fisheries management are applicable to the management of other natural resources. Thanks for your time.